Paul's for the introduction, which I assume was a generous one since I don't understand Latvian. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here in Riga for the first time. It's a privilege to have my book launched in translation in this way. And finally, it's a privilege to be allowed to speak to you in my own language. So every generation needs to write history in a different way. It's not because the next generation is more intelligent than the one before. It isn't even mainly because there is new information. It's above all because historians are like translators. They translate from the language of the past into the language of the present. As the present changes, then the interpretation has to change. So I think today it's no accident that attention is turning to the history of the environment, and in the second place, to the history of knowledge, thanks to the debates about the knowledge society or the information society in which we're living. And in the third place, that attention is turning to the theme of cultural hybridity. In the 1930s, interest in cultural hybridity was almost confined to scholars who were studying Brazil and the Caribbean. Indeed, it was almost confined to scholars who themselves came from either Cuba or Brazil. Today, in an age of intense migration, we find anthropologists, sociologists, linguists, and specialists in cultural studies. They've all become fascinated with the theme of cultural encounters, cultural exchanges, and cultural translation. In my view, historians also have a role to play in this expanding field. What we have to offer is that we focus on process. So in this case, we don't talk so much about hybridity, the state, even though that's the title of this book. We talk especially about the process of hybridization. And I'd like to distinguish three stages in this process. I should be changing, that's it. First comes the moment of encounter between two cultures. So, of course, more exactly, it's an encounter between a small number of people in each of the two cultures. The second stage is that of the appropriation by people in one culture of fragments from the culture of the other culture. Now, these fragments at this point are more often simply juxtaposed to the traditional elements. They don't yet fuse. But the third and final stage is the stage of some kind of fusion, or if you like, of the crystallization of some new hybrid form. The integration of the fragments into a new system. Linguists would call it creolization. The metaphor that I find most helpful for thinking about this subject is to talk about the formation of new ecotypes. This is a term that I've borrowed from a distinguished Swedish folklorist, Carl von Zödorf, maybe best known today because his son is the famous actor Max von Sydow. But Carl von Sydow deserves attention in his own right. And he borrowed from botany, as he said, this idea of the ecotype, the local variety of something. He himself was particularly interested in local varieties of international folk tales. But I'm wanting to pick up this idea and run with it in a slightly different direction. That is to talk much more broadly about the formation of local ecotypes in language, we would call them dialects, or in painting, or in sculpture, architecture, literature, and so on. And what I'd like to do now is to explore the culture of the Renaissance from this angle, to look at the European Renaissance as a set of so many examples of cultural hybridity. Now, of course, the Renaissance is, in a sense, hybrid by definition, because it was an attempt by people in the late Middle Ages to revive a quite different culture, that of classical antiquity, and in particular of ancient Rome. All the same, I believe that insufficient attention has been paid by historians of the Renaissance to this process of hybridization. It took place in a great variety of situations and also of locales, from Florence, say, to Moscow, and beyond Europe, from Goa to Arequipa. Now, we can look at this process of hybridization at two different levels. At the macro historical level, what we see is the contact. I would even say we see the collision between two great systems of signs. You'll see that I was a student in the 60s when structuralism was at its point of greatest enthusiasm, and I still find some of the structuralist concepts to be useful. So a collision between two systems of signs. On one side, the Gothic; on the other side, the revived classical system. Both systems penetrated many domains, many media, and even different materials. So you could see both Gothic and classical in stone, in wood, in metal, in glass, on parchment, in textiles, and so on. And the two styles shaped and decorated objects that ranged from tiny jewels to huge cathedrals. But so that's, if you like, the Olympian view from above, looking at two systems as a whole. But we also need a micro-historical perspective to see what it was that individuals thought they were doing when they were combining elements from different styles, different cultures. We can observe a variety of individual responses to the great collision between Gothic and classical. I'd like to distinguish three responses in particular. So one response is what the linguists call code switching, but it's not only a phenomenon of language. You can switch between visual styles as well as between languages. So take the case of the Italian artist Pisanello. Some of his paintings are more in a more Gothic style, others are in a more classical style. Art historians began by assuming a kind of conversion, that he discovered the Renaissance and changed his style. But the dates don't fit. It turns out that he practiced the two styles together. He alternated between them according to the demands of particular patrons. Now, and then there was a stylistic self-consciousness in the 15th century, which I think was new. You find people in the 15th and 16th centuries contrasting two styles. In German, they use the word Manier, or sometimes they use the word Sitte, which we now translate as customs. So on one side, the ancient or Italian style, and on the other, what they call the German or the modern style. Modern, paradoxically enough, meaning what we call medieval, that is, the Gothic. Second reaction to the great collision of styles was self-conscious syncretism, a practice that we would often call today cultural translation. A book by a Florentine philosopher, Marsilio Ficino, illustrates this quite nicely. So he wrote a book called Platonic Theology, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it means that he was trying to, to baptize Plato, but at the same time he was Platonizing Christianity. But a third possibility is not conscious. It depends on what Pierre Bourdieu famously called the habitus, that is, knowledge and skills that have been so firmly internalized that we have forgotten that we have them. They generate practices. The habitus is originally learned by imitation, but it becomes a kind of second nature. And this is true for sculptors, as it's true, say, for boxers, or indeed for lecturers. But now, take the case of artisans who, let's say, in the year 1400 in Italy, are asked to work in a new style, the revived classical style. But they were trained in the Gothic. Their habitus is Gothic. However hard they may be trying to follow this classical model, they may have been shown some kind of pattern book, somehow or other their hand is going to behave in its traditional manner, and so they Gothicize the classical style that they are trying to imitate. Now, to assess the importance of hybridization in the Renaissance, it would, of course, be necessary to investigate a wide range of forms and practices. One would have to talk about language and about literature, about painting and sculpture, about music, about handwriting, even about law, because the revived Roman law in a number of countries in the 16th century in particular came into collision, and once again, with the customary law that had been obtaining in those countries for earlier centuries. So some kind of compromise, some kind of hybridization takes place in that sphere as well. But as you can imagine, that if I am going to speak to you without going on much too long, it's very sensible to concentrate attention on something more precise than this whole range of practices. And from now on, I've decided to focus on architecture. Architecture is particularly likely to reveal hybridization for several different reasons. In the first place, because patrons played a more active role in when they commissioned buildings than they did when they commissioned, let's say, paintings. They had their own needs. They might be practical needs, they might be symbolic needs. These needs might even conflict with what the architect really wanted to do. And the result might be a compromise, which then is a kind of hybridity. And in the second place, building is a collective art, much more than painting and sculpture were in the Renaissance, despite the existence of painters' workshops. So you have the architect, which is a new role emerging in the Renaissance, but the architect has to be collaborating with quite a large number of masons, carpenters, and so on. Once again, there are times of conflict, some of them quite well documented, and again, the result may be a kind of compromise. So you find, if you like, a bricolage in a literal sense, as well as in the famous metaphorical sense that the term bricolage was given by Claude Lévi-Strauss when he was thinking about la pensée sauvage, like traditional or wild thought, and particularly about mythology. And then in the third place, architecture is particularly sensitive to local conditions, which include climate and, of course, also the material one builds in, stone, brick, wood, and so on. And on top of all that, a building constructed in one century may be extended in another, and you will find a cathedral or a country house. If the main part is in the style of one century, one of the wings or one of the transepts may be in the style of another. So in what follows, I want to be speaking about Renaissance architecture, and I want to do that in 3 parts of the world. Obviously, I need to say something about Italy itself, also about other parts of Europe, and then beyond Europe, especially, though not exclusively, in the Americas. And in fact, I mean to begin now with the Americas on the grounds that the greater the distance between 2 cultures, the clearer the process of hybridization will appear. So at this point, that was the wrong way. So what you're now looking at is the facade of a church in Arequipa in Peru. A church that was built in the early 17th century. They called the church La Compañía because it was built by the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, or as they said in Spanish at the time, the Company of Jesus. Now, in certain ways, this is a typical late Renaissance church. It's got its columns here, and then the next floor, and that follows patterns which you can find in Rome, from which the style, this new style of church, radiated outwards. But the background is a bit different. I think here everything's decorated. There's a kind of horror vacui. Everything's got to be decorated, where you'd find blank spaces if it was an Italian church or a Spanish church. People thought that having the columns there, that was sufficient decoration. And then, I don't think the slide is clear enough for this, but you will find, first, when animals appear, they're sometimes local animals, such as pumas, that will never be found on churches in Europe. And it's also been suggested that the abstract decoration is really rather like the textiles in which the Peruvians specialized in the age of the Incas before the Spaniards had arrived. So, of course, it's important to remember that although the church is commissioned by a Spanish Jesuit, the people that actually build it are largely indigenous. So, once again, they would have the habitus of artisans from the Inca Peru that preceded the Spanish viceroyalty. And again, churches were built on the site of former temples. There's a famous case also in Peru, in Cusco, where the cathedral was built on the site of a temple of the sun god, that is Viracocha. Not only that, but they used a lot of the same stones. So once again then, there's a kind of hybridity, not so visible because the stones from the Peruvian temple are the ones closer to the ground, but still they are there. And so in this case, I think it's not the Church of the Compañía by itself. There are a number of churches in this general style, which art historians have named either the estilo mestizo, that is the mixed style, or they sometimes call it Peruvian hybrid Baroque. It's at the point where it's difficult to decide whether one should say late Renaissance or early Baroque. But in any case, hybrid. Now, the emergence of this hybrid style may have been encouraged by the Jesuits. I don't think it's an accident that one of the best examples, the one you're looking at, is a Jesuit church. And in Quito, it's the same thing. It's the Church of the Compañía there that illustrates hybridity best. And why should the Jesuits be especially important? because their strategy of conversion to Christianity was what they themselves called the strategy of accommodation. That is, you adapted the Christian message to the culture of the people you were preaching to. In Rome, some people were shocked. They thought that the Jesuits were not converting the American Indians, but they were being converted by them. They said the same thing about the mission in China. But that means the Jesuits were unusually willing to engage in a kind of cultural hybridization. They would say they kept the essentials of the Christian message, but what wasn't essential, that could change from one culture to another. But there's another point I want to make, which is that they are Spanish Jesuits. That is, they come from a country which quite recently, in the 16th century, had been a multicultural country. From the time that the Arabs invaded Spain in the 8th century until the year 1492, when the Muslim kingdom of Granada was conquered by the Christians, all that period you have Muslims, Christians, Jews living together in the Iberian Peninsula, and no one group is dominant. And you see a great deal of cultural interaction, I think. This is a secular example. So, and interestingly, this is a palace that was built after 1492, and it was built for Spanish noblemen who had been to Italy, who had admired Venice, Florence, and Rome, and come back to build himself a palace, which in some ways looks Islamic. I mean, this decoration on the arches is very Islamic. The decoration you won't see clearly enough here. But then you have a Renaissance fountain there. You have Renaissance columns here. You have a mixture of people building this palace. Certain people were brought from Italy to produce the classical part, and then there were the local craftsmen. It seems to be the case that in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, the people that most often became masons and carpenters were of Arab descent. And so they carry on their tradition, the Islamic tradition of decorating without images. So you have calligraphic decoration, you have floral decoration, you have what were already known in the Renaissance as arabesques. And maybe even more spectacular, you see this in churches. So mosques, synagogues, churches were decorated in this same style with the geometrical and calligraphic and floral decoration. And so you may wonder, and I think this is an important question to ask at this point, how did people living at the time regard this kind of decoration? And it looks as if the Christians did not see this decoration as something that was Islamic, something that was foreign to them. It seems that more likely that they thought it was the local ecotype. It was the style that showed that they were living in the south of Spain. This, I should say, is a palace from Seville. It's called the Casa de Pilatos. If I had another slide of the interior with all the decorated tiles, it would look even more like a mosque than the courtyard does. And one argument in favor of the interpretation I've just put forward is that when Spaniards went to Mexico, they built some buildings in this very style, which was known as the Mudéjar style, derived from the name of Muslims living under Christian rule in late medieval Spain, and then gradually being applied to a particular form of decoration. So the last twist in my argument, I think you have the Spanish Jesuits, so they're used to this situation of convivencia. And so, thank you. I think they are more prepared to accept a hybridization in the New World between, in Peru, Inca traditions and Spanish traditions, more prepared than non-Spaniards would have been. So partly because they were Jesuits, partly because they were Spaniards, they welcome a kind of hybridity that other clergy might not have done. So speaking about this mudéjar style brings us to other parts of Europe. Now, let me take an extreme case once again. This is an extreme case, I think, of cultural distance within Europe. So you have a style that began in Italy, and now it's being imitated in Eastern Europe, more exactly this chapel, which is called the Boimi Chapel, and some of you may know it. It's from Lviv. So it's got a very unusual form of decoration, especially this part. And the art historians have suggested that this is Armenian. From the 14th century on, there was a considerable group of Armenians living in Lviv. Indeed, they'd built a cathedral of their own. And rather like the craftsmen of Arab descent, you found a lot of Armenians working in crafts like as carpenters and especially in metalwork. They were much in demand, not only in Europe, but outside. So they became a kind of mediator between East and West. So in the early 17th century, when this chapel was built, there were Armenian craftsmen working in Istanbul for the Sultan and his court. There were other Armenian craftsmen working in Persia for the Shah and his court. And as for the rest of the chapel, well, this is it's designed by a German from Silesia, which is already culturally mixed German-Polish area. And he brought some craftsmen with him to execute the design. So you have a style which originated in Italy, but it's being interpreted by a mixture of Silesian and Armenian craftsmen, so it's not surprising that the result looks a bit different from what you might see, let's say, in Tuscany or even Venice. So I move now to Western Europe, and this is very well known. It's the Chateau of Chambord. And that illustrates the dilemma of patrons. Patrons want very often to build in the new fashionable style, that is the classical style. But they are also concerned with the function of a building. In this case, it's King Francis I of France, and he wants a castle. He's thinking about the need for defense. Ancient Romans didn't have castles. So it's a medieval castle in its basic structure. No, it's got these more or less circular towers at all the four corners. But Italian architects and masons came in, and you see their work particularly around here in the decoration of the roof, which is quite unlike anything to have been seen in France until that time, which is the beginning of the 16th century. So this was what Francis I wanted, and so here you have a palace belonging to his rival Henry VIII of England, Hampton Court. Actually not built by Henry VIII, but built by his Cardinal Wolsey, one of his leading ministers. The problem was that Wolsey was too ambitious, and people made the joke that Hampton Court was grander than the King's Court. At the last moment, Wolsey tried to placate the king by giving him Hampton Court, which still belongs to the British royal family. but he miscalculated in the timing and he was disgraced. But anyway, the point I want to make, this is a typical late medieval English gatehouse. Look, Gothic arch for you to come in. But then consider these roundels here. These are typically Renaissance. So you have these sculptures are modeled on ancient Roman coins, and what they show are profile portraits of two Roman emperors. Again, it was fashionable to have inside your house 12 portraits of 12 Roman emperors. The 12 emperors that's of whom an ancient Roman, Suetonius, wrote the biography. This was a way of demonstrating that you knew about classical culture, that you were part of the Renaissance movement. Oh, yeah. In the case of architecture, as I was saying, there is a practical side as well, which means that some form of adaptation is almost necessary to survival. So what Italians could imitate ancient Rome fairly closely because the climate was more or less the same. But what happens in Northern Europe? Because it's colder, you have to modify designs to have more space for chimneys. There's one case of an English country house where the chimneys are disguised as classical columns, complete with Ionic capitals. It looks rather strange to have these columns on the roof, but that's why they were there. Adaptation of this kind is actually discussed in architectural treatises of the 16th century. There's one Flemish artist who made his reputation by publishing engraved designs from which then the customers could choose the particular fireplace they liked or the particular house facade they liked. And in the introduction to one of his pattern books, he says that most of the time we should follow the classical rules, but we can break them on occasion, as he put it, to accommodate art to the situation and needs of the country. So he's using the same word as the Jesuits, accommodation. He's consciously talking about the need to adapt, if you like, to hybridize, or in this case I would say, to perform a cultural translation. Well, now it's time, I think, to turn to Italy itself. And what you see on the screen is a cathedral that was built in Tuscany, and the patron was a pope, Pope Pius II, the architect Antonio Rossellino. This cathedral you will find in a small town called Pienza. It's not a coincidence. In honor of the Pope, the local hero, the town changed its name from Corsignano to Pienza, and it's still called Pienza to this day. Now, what's curious about this small cathedral is that from outside, it is essentially a Renaissance building with the round arches, with the classical columns, very much a classical portico like this. But then if we look inside, it looks very much more like a Gothic church. Not completely. If you look at the tracery very carefully, it's not quite, there are not so many pointed arches as you would expect in Gothic churches elsewhere in Europe at this time. And even these columns, this little bit looks a bit classical, but the overall impression, I think, is definitely Gothic. Now, again, I'd like to ask the question, what did the patron think about this mixture? And in fact, I chose this particular example because Pius II wrote a lot. He was, in fact, a Renaissance humanist, a leading humanist, before he was ever elected Pope. And in his writings, in particular, a book he wrote about Central Europe, when he was on diplomatic missions there, he tells us something about his architectural taste. He was sensitive to the beauty of Gothic churches in Germany. And very intriguingly, to my mind, he selected for a special praise one cathedral, the Cathedral of Strasbourg, which happens to be the cathedral that Goethe, centuries later, was so enthusiastic about. And Goethe's enthusiastic description of Strasbourg Cathedral helped to launch the Gothic revival in Germany, and it spread right across Europe. So it's very intriguing that a Renaissance humanist was attracted by that very same building. So basically I'm saying posterity has come to see the Gothic and the classical as different styles. I could even say to see them as antithetical styles. But at the time, some patrons, some artists found them equally attractive alternatives and saw no reason why one shouldn't try to combine them. In short, the result of the great collision between the Gothic and the classical styles was the production of new ecotypes in England, in France, in Poland, elsewhere. And I think the term ecotype is particularly useful because it offers us a solution to a problem that has often been raised by critics of the idea of cultural hybridity. This idea has sometimes been criticized on the grounds it assumes the purity of cultures before hybridization takes place. But of course, no culture is pure. Classical culture was not pure because the Romans imitated the Greeks, but the Greeks had drawn inspiration from other cultures generally to their east. In a similar way, medieval culture was not pure because it arose out of a combination of classical tradition, Christianity, and what, with a convenient oxymoron, I would call the civilization of the barbarians, that is, the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, and so on. Somehow it was all mixed together over centuries, and then this distinctive Gothic ecotype emerges from it. But now, if every culture is hybrid, it doesn't seem terribly useful to introduce the concept of cultural hybridity. But one possible reply to this criticism is, of course, to say that the process of hybridization does not take place at the same speed and to the same extent in all cultures. At times of massive migration, including ours, you see very much more hybridization than at other times. And the other reply that one can make, I think, is that the third stage of hybridization, what I called crystallization or fusion, it produces these new ecotypes, which then become the norm, and then they're stable. You could even say that they are relatively pure, until, of course, the next cultural encounter sets off the process all over again. So I'm offering a kind of cyclical model in which, again and again, the concept of cultural hybridity turns out to be useful. Now, I should confess, just to conclude, that this approach to the Renaissance in terms of hybridity is not a completely new one. When I was a student at Oxford in the 1950s, the professor of art history, himself something of a hybrid because he was a refugee from Germany who had arrived in England and rebuilt his career. Edgar Vint used to lecture to packed audiences about the art of the Italian Renaissance. And he used the term hybridity to refer to the combination or mix of classical and Christian culture. One of his examples was Botticelli. when Botticelli paints Venus and when he paints the Madonna, can you tell the difference? Because in a way he's Christianized Venus and he's classicized the Madonna, and so these images look very similar. But the current concern with cultural hybridity goes much further than Vint would have imagined, even where the Renaissance is concerned, which is why I found myself talking about Armenian craftsmen, about Islamic craftsmen, about indigenous Peruvian artisans in a talk about the Renaissance. So the result of this concern, which I think is very much of our time, this collective concern with hybridization, it's to focus attention on a whole range of artifacts, paintings, buildings, and so on, that earlier approaches neglected. I think partly because art historians were embarrassed by them, because they were mixed, they weren't pure. That is, they were not sufficiently clear and distinct examples of the Renaissance style. All the same, a historian wants to say, these mixed productions have their place in history, and indeed, even more important perhaps, they have their own beauty. I don't think we should allow purist prejudices to prevent us from appreciating the beauty of buildings like that church in Arequipa or that chapel in Lviv. Thank you for your attention. Yes, I didn't say anything about Russia today, and there is a very interesting story to tell about an Italian architect, Aristotele Fioravanti, who was invited by the Tsar to come and design a cathedral not far from the Kremlin, and then was told that this cathedral had to follow the pattern of the cathedral of in Vladimir. So this makes even more clear the dilemma between wanting something in the fashionable style, but then also wanting something that fits in with one's own cultural traditions. So uneasy compromise. But I don't know Riga well enough, but what I noticed very vividly in my various visits to a city which is hard to name, rather like Lviv, because it has rival names, and according to which name you use, you line up with one political group against another. So officially Cluj-Napoca, to Hungarians Kolozsvár, to Germans Klausenburg, and I sometimes think it's better to use the Latin name Claudiopolis because it detaches one from all these controversies. There are the Uniate churches. So they're very like the Orthodox churches, but after all, because they're using the Latin rite, well, the architect has also made some concessions to this compromise, and I think the result is a rather beautiful hybrid form. It's too late for me to have discussed in today's talk. It's post-Renaissance, but we are talking about a particular style or particular ecotype of the Baroque, which I must say I found extremely attractive, though it's not what an Italian would call Baroque, and it's not what a specialist in Eastern Christendom would call a typically Orthodox church. It's a funny kind, but I think a beautiful kind of mix. I come near because I have a problem hearing people.
When we are claiming that cultures are mixed or hybrid, when it's hybridic kind of culture, is some kind of different claim about culture than when we are saying it's pure or something like that. Now, but would you say that there is difference between contingent hybridization and some hybridization that tells something about, let's say, our culture? So is there a difference between hybridization in Spain, where you said Islamic architecture was mixed with, I don't know, Christian architecture, or for example, I don't know, this Chinese kind of palace that George IV built in Brighton, yes, or just across the street there's a mall where there are some really gaudy kind of absurd fountain made in the style of, I don't know, Italian kind of style, which doesn't really, it is kind of hybridization, but I wouldn't say it tells very much about our culture.
Well, I've never thought of using the term contingent before, and that would be opposed to, you would say, necessary hybridization, I suppose. Well, definitely there's a distinction to make between a hybridization which is taking place among many people inside a given culture, and that would fit the Spanish example, and another one which is involving very few people, like the Prince Regent and his favorite architect, John Nash, and a small group of mainly aristocratic English people who were attracted by a sort of Orientalism. In fact, although there is a dragon pavilion there, it's very far from being what a Chinese would recognize as a Chinese pavilion. It's partly Indian and partly Chinese, which suggests, probably this is the case, that to English eyes at the beginning of the 19th century, there was no real difference between different kinds of Eastern architecture. Middle East, Far East, Chinese, Indian, all cheerfully mixed together. I would agree with you that that's more superficial than the Spanish example, but I suppose I would distinguish them most in terms of, has the hybridization reached a lot of people in the culture, or is it just something that interests a small number? But thank you for the question.
Well, perhaps I'll try to ask. I'm Igor Vatolin, journalist. So when you speak on big style and all kinds of hybridic variations, so it's clear what do we want to say. But if we speak on elements of ethnicity, of nationality in art, architecture, so does it make any sense? So it belongs to the time of Romanticism. So in your hybridic approach, so what is the place of ethnicity, of this national roots in speaking on art, culture? Well, that's the question.
Yes, so I was talking about a period before the rise of nationalism, in which, yes, there is a certain degree of ethnic consciousness, but nothing like the degree to which you see in the 19th and 20th centuries. I suppose that does mean a break, because it means that purity is becoming an ideal which has got political associations. If you want to have a painting, have a style of painting and architecture that expresses your ethnic group, then you're going to be against any kind of borrowing from outside. But then there is a paradox, which, I mean, there's the paradox of the rise of nationalism in 19th century Europe, is that each group, each nation sees itself as unique, but this process of nation building is so similar in different countries, including the cultural forms that it takes, the the landscape painters who celebrate the national landscape and so on. The standardization of folk costumes to be more like national costumes rather than the costumes just of villages or small regions. So it is a very different world from the one that I was talking about, and one which becomes, which is threatened as soon as you have large-scale migration. So this is a big story, a different story from the one I wanted to tell today, but of course another story which it's very important that historians try to tell, and in as impartial a fashion as they can.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Paldies. I hope we will continue discussions further. Katra grāmatas atvēršana sastāv no formālās daļas un no neformālās, un ir pagājusi stunda. Un tas nozīmē, ka tuvojas neformālā daļa ar glāzi vīna blakus telpā, bet pirms tam mēs vēlamies pateikt vairākus paldies. Un šī grāmata nebūtu varējusi iznākt bez Friedricha Eberta fonda finansiāla atbalsta. Friedricha Eberta fonda projekta menedžera Denis Kanava intelektuāla atbalsta. Es gribētu lūgt Denis Kanavu teikt pāris vārdus.
Great, I just gather all this.
Dažs vārdus, kas pirmkārt gribēju pateikt, īstenībā varētu patulkot mums tiešiem. Man ir milzīgi paldies profesoram par to, ka profesors ir atradis gan laiku, gan enerģiju un spēkus atbraukt uz Latviju un dalīties ar mums tātad domās, idejas, iecerēs. Šeit daudzi no mums pat esošie esam sekojuši profesorā daļrādējas teiktu, jo zinātnisku tekstu ir jāizveidojami kā daļrādes literatūras žanrs ar daudzam atsaucam, un mēs visi gaidām arī tālāku profesorā ideju attīstības sakarā renesanses mākslu. Es sapratu, ka šodien mums visvērtīgākā lieta šeit bija parasts biroja krēsls, kas daudziem pietrūka, bet tas arī nozīmē, ka tomēr liela interese ir, un ka interese ir tik liela, ka pārsniedz šīs modernas ēkas iespējas, tas nozīmē, ka mums noteikti ir nepieciešams turpināt sarunas, un es ļoti ceru, ka profesoram būs iespēja vēlreiz atbraukt uz Latviju, pavadīt vairāk laika, iepazīt arī mūsu ļoti raibu un ļoti sarežģītu sabiedrību, kas pat labam ir diskusiju centra par to, ko nozīmē nācija, tautā, kas ir savējie, kas nav savējie, kas pieder, kas nepieder, kur ir robežas. Jūsu grāmatā to ir parādījis izcili, kā nav vieglu atbildu, un paldies Dievam, ka tādu nav. Milīgi paldies jums par jūsu ieguldījumu Eiropas un pasaules mēroga diskusijas par kultūras datāru. Paldies!
Paldies. We are hoping this is not your last visit to Rīgā. Otrkārt, šī grāmata, šis tulkojums ir Latvijas literatūras kultūras un mākslas institūta tulkojums sērijā teorija, kurā līdz šim mēs esam laiduši klajā Rolāna Bārka grāmatu teksta balda un Džuditas Batlers grāmatu Dzimtas nemieres. Es esmu tā tulkotājs pateicīgs Literatūras kultūras un mākslas institūtam par atmosfēru, kas ir rosinājusi gan radošu garu, gan iniciatīvu, gan arī iespēju domāt. Institūtu šodien pārstāv pētnieks Jānis Ozoliņš, kas vēlētos lūgt līdz ilgstošs vārds.
I'm very glad to welcome Mr. Bērka to this event in Rīgā, and this book is the third edition in our series, Theoria, and today's event is special because of the presence of the author. I'm sure his lecture we've heard today, together with the book, will expand our understanding of contemporary life and be more prepared for its challenges to live in modern nations, especially in translation. There are very few translations of that book, published in last 8 years. So every book in our series is really significant for us. The team that makes these books possible are translators, editors, and proofreader and designer. Many thanks to them also. Many thanks also to the Kembridžas Foundation for our successful collaboration in publishing significant original books for Latvian readers. And many thanks to you, Professor Bērka, for coming, and I hope you enjoy today's Rīgā. Yeah. Kā teorijas sērijas rekolēģijas pārstāvji man pēc 5 ilgas dienas par profesoru Bērku viesošanos. Un atklājot šīs grāmatas 3. izdevumu, jūs patiešām ir īpaši notikums, ka pats autors ir klātesošs. Es vēlētos atgādināt, ka tieši Latvijā teorijas sēriju tulkojumu mēdz būt ne tik bieži parādīt, bet katrā ziņā mēs esam cenšies, lai šī sērija būtu lasītājiem pieejama. Kā jūs redzat, arī Pītera Bērka grāmatiņa ir tapusi tāda maza grāmatiņa, kā bija vārsta gadījumā, un 2 formāti ir esēju formāti un grāmatas formāti, kā bija Jūrikas Latvaras gadījumā. Un es no tiesas vēlos pateikties tiem, kas šajā procesā bijuši iesaistīti, gan tulkotājiem, šodien noteikti Paulam, gan zinātniskiem redaktoriem, Ievai Kolmanei šīs grāmatas gadījumā, un arī gan mūsu grāmatu māksliniecei, un arī no korektora Daina Vēnesātais māksliniecei. Līgai Sakanai par ieguldīto darbu, un tiešām nesaucīt ieguldīto darbu, un es ceru, ka šī sērija turpināsies visas redzīgi. Un no tiesas man tikai vēlos pateikties arī, un tikai tāpēc modernības sadarbību, tad šī sērija iespējama, un to varam priecāties gan grāmatas veidotājs, gan arī gan lasītājs. Paldies!
Un noslēdzot pateicības, es vēlos pilst no savas puses, ka man kā tulkotājiem darbs pie šīs grāmatas tapšanas sagādāja brīnišķīgu pieredzi galvenokārt kā iemesla dēļ, ka man bija iespēja strādāt kopā ar talantīgiem cilvēkiem, kā jau minēja Jānis, ar zinātnisko redaktoru Ievu Kolmani, ar literāro redaktoru Dainu Lēnetu, kuri paveica daudz vairāk man šķiet nekā es pats, ar projektu koordinatoriem Benediktu Kalmatu, Kādu Mēdiju, Jānu Ozoliņu, un visbeidzot man vislielākā pateicība ir profesoram Pīteram Bērkam par brīnišķīgām sarunām gan Kembridžā, gan šeit Rīgā, par iedvesmu un par viņa atbalstu arī manā pētnieciskajā darbā. I'm most grateful to Professor Pītera Bērka for our wonderful conversations, for inspiration, and for your help in my own research work. Liels paldies! Thank you very much! Un šis ir brīdis, lai mēs pārvietotos uz blakus telpu un atvilkt daudz. Paldies!